The preliminary report involving the Air India 787 that crashed over a month ago has been released. And right now, what they're thinking is, well, something happened in the cockpit. And I'm going to tell you what it is. And I'm also going to tell you what a 787 captain told me when I told him all the circumstances that they had discovered involved in this particular accident. And let's take a look at the accident in particular. Now, on your screen, you're going to see who the individuals were flying the plane. On this particular date, the first officer was doing the takeoff, his turn. His name is Cleve Kundar, and he was at the controls, and the captain was his backup in this particular situation. They took off and started flying. And once you get the right speed, you launch the aircraft, it gets up in the air. Normally what happens is once you get a positive rate of climb indicated on your altimeter, you call gear up, and the co-pilot, or who's ever the second officer, if you will, pulls up the gear, and that just starts the process. But you'll notice if you watch the video, the gear never came up. And because the gear didn't come up, something was going on in the cockpit. And as it was, right around that time when the plane took off and got around 400 feet in the air, the two control switches. Now, I want you to see those switches in particular. Let me flip this over here for you to see. There, take a look at that. Those are the two fuel control switches that are right below the throttles. And that's the way it is in a lot of different airplanes nowadays. Fuel control switches turn the engines off. So when you come in, you're ready to shut the engines down. The switches are spring-loaded. And this means something simple. You have to literally pull them up because there's a spring detent. Pull them up, and then you can turn them off or on. But you must pull them up to get the spring out and clear a locking section right here below the switch itself. So you've got to get out of that detent and be able to pull it out to flip it down. Two of them. That's the way you shut the engines off. You can't just walk over to it and go, hey, I'm going to flip the hand and it drops down. Doesn't work that way. These are detent spring-loaded. So that being said, according to the report, they said somebody switched off the engine control switches. There's two of them, but they were switched off in 1 second sequences, which means this. One was shut off, and then 1 second later, the other one was shut off. That takes someone pulling out the spring, pulling down the detent, and dropping it down to the lower area, which means off. Someone had to do that. One person in the airplane in the cockpit, I presume it was the captain, saying, hey, did you turn off the fuel control switches? And the other person saying, no, I didn't do it. But at that moment, things were going to go bad. They were going to go bad fast because that plane, without the engines, without the thrust, very heavy, hot, it was going to start coming down, and it did. Well, apparently the captain took control of the aircraft at that point, so I got the aircraft, flipped the fuel control switches on to see if we could get the engines to start up. Now, they were already in a spool down situation. Trying to get them started up wasn't going to be enough because, frankly, it didn't work. And the plane keep going down and keep going down. And we know what happened. Ultimately, the plane crashed and killed 270 people. Now, here's the deal. The FAA had put out a special notice saying, hey, these detent switches could become, have an issue with them. But it was not for the 787. It was for a 737. Now, the design is pretty much the same for the 787, but it was for the 737. Therefore, it wasn't checked in this particular airplane. But when they were coming down, some things happened. You probably heard about this. You heard they say, well, there's something came down the bottom of the airplane. It's called a RAT, ram air turbine. It comes down, hits the wind stream, starts power going. Puts some power to the controls so the pilot's got some controls over the things that are going on, and that's how it keeps control. But also, when they turn them back on again, suddenly the auxiliary power units came back on. They're in the tail of the airplane like a little jet back there, provides electrical and air conditioning and stuff. When you get on an airplane, you see, hey, everything's off and running. Well, that's the auxiliary power unit that does that. So they were trying everything they could to get that plane to come back to power. And without power in those engines, that giant airplane is going to sink. And it did sink. You saw it on TV. You saw the explosion. And that huge ball of fire was because that plane was loaded with Jet A, gasoline, if you will. When that crashed, that plane was full of gasoline. And man, it went up as a torch, killing all those people. Now, I had the occasion to talk to a friend of mine who flies that airplane here in the United States, and we were talking about what was going on. And he said, "Well, maybe the switches were in the center position, and the gravity came in and flipped them down as they rotated." I said, "Well, here's the deal. According to the report, the switches were turned off within 1 second of each other." He looked at me and he said, "What?" I said, "Yeah, whoever did it pulled it out. One was pulled out and pulled down. And 1 second later, the second one was pulled out and pulled down." He said, "Then it ain't an accident." I said, "What?" He said, "Can't be an accident. That was done specifically by someone." And I said, "What do you think it was?" He said, "Well, you got two people in the cockpit. You got captain and the first officer. Which one it was, there's no telling, because the final report's not going to come out until maybe a year from now. But right now, he's thinking that it was probably the first officer who had some sort of death wish. I can't guarantee that and say that was him, but I can tell you right now, according to a 787 captain, what happened can't happen. And what did happen was somebody flipped those switches off intentionally. And right now, the person who was flying the aircraft, whose hands were on the throttle, right there on the throttle, but below that throttle area is those two switches. Somebody flipped them off. Was it the captain who flipped them off, or was it the first officer? Right now, the cockpit voice recorder doesn't let us know, and we're not really sure who it is. But apparently, someone in that cockpit apparently had a death wish. That's exactly what a 787 pilot thinks. Is he right? We won't know till maybe a year from now, or we may never know. It's just how it all works out.